with us the former CEO of Poverty Alleviation Fund as chair of the session. Unfortunately, due to certain pressing commitment, Sadiq Sanjarani Saab isn't able to make it to this session. So as one of the senior most distinguished speaker on the panel, Qazi Isa Saab will do us the honors of chair of the session, and he kindly agreed to it. Further, we have Mr. Suhail Anwar, Dr. Suhail Anwar, advisor, Subnational Governance Program, FCDO, and the core organizer of this panel. We also have with us Dr. Waqar Ahmed, Joint Executive Director, STPI, and also the organizer of this plenary session. We'll soon be joined by Executive Director, STPI, who's actually stuck in this traffic, the situation that has evolved just in a couple of hours. We will be joined by Makhdoom Hashim Jawan Bakht Sahib, the Provincial Minister of Punjab for Finance, as keynote speaker. He'll be joining us shortly online. We also have the presence of Mr. Nadeem Hussain, the founder of Easy Pesa and CEO Planet N Group of companies. Sir, we are honored to have your presence here. We have the company of Captain Retired Saeed Ahmed Nawaz. Captain Retired Saeed Ahmed Nawaz is currently the Additional Secretary, Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety Division, and is representing the federal government. We'll soon be joined by Ms. Dinish Fatma Sahi, the CEO, Punjab Social Protection Authority. We will also be joined online by Mr. Muhammad Ali Asghar, the Chief Economist of KPK and representative of the government of KPK. We also have the pleasure of the company of Engineer Khurram Dastagir Khan, Member National Assembly and former Federal Minister for Defense and Commerce. We'll be joined online by Dr. Adil Malik as well, the Associate Professor at Oxford University, UK. We have with us Mr. Henlo Van Nieuwen Hussein. My apologies if I am not pronouncing it right. Mr. Henlo is the Principal Consultant, Oxford Policy Management, UK. And we also have Mr. Syed Mustafa, the Technical Advisor, Social Protection, GIZ, Pakistan. So I hope I have covered all the panelists. And now I would request the chair of the session, Qazi Asmat Isa Saab, to formally open the session.
Thank you very much, Dr. Faria. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum. A very warm welcome to everyone on this Court Islamabad evening. Distinguished guests, panelists, and participants, thank you very much. I'd like to start by congratulating SDPI and FCDO for holding this very important and very timely conference. After 2 years of COVID, it would be good to take stock of what has happened, how have we dealt with it, and what are the lessons learned going forward. And it's going to be a long evening because, mashallah, we have 15 very, very distinguished speakers. It's a galaxy of stars right across the spectrum of all the institutions that we have, from government to private sector to civil society to provincial governments. So it's a real star-studded event. And I have been I'm sitting in for the chairman's Senate. So that means that me being from Balochistan retains the seat of this chair. So I'm happy to do that. I'd like to actually, without further ado, to request, let me just set the scene in terms of the conference itself, in terms of what are the expectations and, what are going to be the takeaways. So with your permission, I will just tell you what the conference is all about and what are our expectations. So Pakistan has a multi-tiered system of governance for social protection programs instituted at the federal, provincial, and district levels. However, the federal and provincial social protection authorities currently lack a common platform to discuss and resolve governance issues, the potential of complementarities and linkages is yet to be explored. Areas for such multi-tiered cooperation range from legal frameworks to institutional development and from initiating vertically aligned schemes to common monitoring and evaluation methods. Immediate areas that require such cooperation include dynamic social data, reliable methods for social outreach and mobilization, payments and social insurance infrastructure, and integrated databases of programs and beneficiaries for a robust monitoring and evaluation system. As the social protection system graduates from mere cash transfers to human development and productive inclusion, the need for people-friendly innovation, financial inclusion, and digital literacy also calls for the attention of policymakers. Given the gaps identified in the social protection initiatives during the COVID-19 crisis, all tiers of the government need to develop long-term synergies and complementarities. Recognizing that a dialogue among the various tiers of government, civil society, and academia can help achieve this objective, the Foreign Development and Commonwealth Office, FCDO, Subnational Governance Program, SNG, and Sustainable Development Policy Institute, SDPI, initiated a series of consultative events in September 2021. This plenary session will be the culmination point of this series and has been preceded by a consultative session and a national learning workshop. So this is to set the scene, and I'd like to actually also congratulate both the organizing SDPI and FCDO for actually again reminding us that the SDGs are the one takeaway for all of these SDGs is leave no one behind. And I think this is extremely important. And as we kind of proceed, we will actually hopefully develop strategies for making sure that we don't leave anybody behind. I would like to kind of now request Dr. Faria to actually introduce the speakers one by one and also be the timekeeper. So over to you, Dr. Faria. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kaisa. So in the landscape of Pakistan, there exists a multi-tiered social protection mechanism. And although the 18th constitutional amendment delegated the social protection as a function of provinces, but still there needs to be done a lot in terms of creating complementarities and synergies or the alignment between the federal and provincial entities. So in this context, from the development sector, the FCDO's subnational governance program has taken some initiatives, and I would like to invite Dr. Suhail Anwar, advisor SNG Punjab, to present the areas of multi-tiered cooperation for social protection for setting the tone and tune of this plenary session. So it's over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saban. And good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's an absolute pleasure being here today speaking at this forum. Before starting the presentation, just a brief introduction of Subnational Governance Program, which is a 4-year technical assistance program of FCDO being administered by Oxford Policy Management. It is supporting provincial and district governments in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa for improved planning, financial management, and governance. And after COVID, it has a new stream of COVID recovery, social protection as well. So some of the work that I'm going to introduce today was done under this stream in the past 1 year. Next, please. Okay, let's see if I can handle it from here, but apparently I can't. So can we go to the next slide, please? Right, so until we have the next slide on, we all know that COVID-19 was a crisis of global proportions. So it was not only Pakistan which was affected, but globally, poverty and vulnerability increased in the wake of COVID. So the table above in this slide shows that poverty, which was estimated, the global poverty, which was forecasted at around 8% for the year 2020, it went up to 9.8%, which actually added over 140 million people. It pushed 140 million people below international poverty line, extreme poverty, which is $1.9 a day. And the second, the bar chart here shows that South Asia is the worst hit region, which had more poverty than any other region in the world as a result of COVID. Next slide, please. Right, and so this is a snapshot from ILO Social Protection Monitor, which shows that soon after the onset of COVID, just 2 months, within the first 2 months, over 200 countries in the world responded with over 1,200 schemes, mostly of social assistance, the main mechanism was either initiating new schemes or expanding the existing schemes vertically and horizontally. Next, please. And in Pakistan, we had these initial estimates. On the left is an estimate by PIDE, which showed that in case of mild impact, the national poverty, which was around 24% before COVID, could have gone up by 9 percentage points. And in case of high impact, it could have gone over 50%. So these were the statistics that we started working with. Luckily, it didn't come to that because of government's immediate measures and smart lockdowns also. On the right, what I'm showing is a survey that was done by Pakistan Bureau of Statistics. So before COVID, about 35% of population 10 plus, economically active population was 35% in Pakistan, which translates to 56 million people. It sharply declined during the lockdown period. It came down to 22%, which is just 35 million people. But then recovery started happening, and by December 2020, 33% people were again able to go back to labor market. There is still a gap of about 4 million people. This is the gap that was there in December last year. Next, please. And this challenge kind of in a different manner. We know that COVID disrupted the supply chain all over the world. And because of that, we are currently facing a wave of inflation, which according to different agencies in Pakistan ranges between 8 and 11%. And on the right, what it is showing is that the source of this inflation comes from a variety of commodities, not only food, but also energy, fuel, and housing, etc. Next, please. So what SNG did in collaboration with the provincial governments of Punjab and KP, first of all, we participated in the post-COVID dialogue. So both governments constituted working groups, and SNG took lead in the social protection working group of Punjab and KP. So because of these dialogues, there were two strategies devised by the provincial governments. In Punjab, SNG drafted a strategy called RISE. RISE is Responsive Investments in Social Protection and Economic Recovery. And in KP, they've contributed to a similar a document called ASME-NAW. Both documents provided a recovery roadmap for the short and medium term. The second area where we collaborated with the governments was that in both provinces, there was no social protection policy. So there was no strategic direction what would be social protection in these provinces, which components or categories or subcategories were part of social protection. So nobody, when we say social protection, there wasn't a common understanding among all departments and agencies. What do we mean by social protection? So we drafted social protection policies for both provinces. And currently, these policies have been approved by the respective planning and development departments. And they are now awaiting cabinet's approval in both provinces. So once they are notified, hopefully then we can go on to strategies and action plans under these policies. And in KP, while in Punjab, we had a social protection authority. So there was also already an overarching umbrella organization in Punjab, but KP didn't have such a setup. So in KP, we also helped government prepare a roadmap of social protection for the next 3 years. And under this roadmap, there are a number of initiatives that will be taken. Can you click on the hyperlink, please? Right, so this is a broad snapshot of the policy. I can't go into its detail because of the paucity of time. But at the bottom left, you can see that the main emphasis government is going to lay on labor market programs, trying to give people skills and livelihood, access to credit, etc. And those who will benefit from these livelihood programs can then enroll on social insurance in the right-hand side column. Social insurance is contributory social protection. So the entire burden of social protection does not rest with the state itself. People contribute, such as EOBI or PESI, social security institutions. But then there is always going to be a group left who cannot sustain on their own or cannot contribute, the elderly, people with disabilities, some marginalized communities. So there would be this category of social assistance for them. And then you can see various principles and objectives, which I'm afraid I don't have the time to go into. Can we go back, please? Right. Another important initiative is the creation of Spatial Vulnerability Index. When COVID hit, the planning departments found that they didn't have a framework for the allocation of resources to various regions in the province. So obviously there are several districts in each of the provinces, and all districts or all regions are not same. Some needed more preventive as well as responsive resource base to cope with the crisis. So if you can click on this hyperlink, please. So we devised an index, which is called Spatial Vulnerability Index. And in the left-hand column, you can see there are dimensions. And then in the middle, what are the variables or indicators that can best define those dimensions. And right is the data source. So what we are going to do is that let me give you the example of Punjab. Punjab has around 150 tehsils. So what we will do is that we, on the basis of this index, and there's another page also, if you can go to the next page. Yeah, so you can see there are 8 dimensions in all. Dimensions such as economic vulnerability, social vulnerability, climate change, conflict, etc. So these are the various bases of vulnerability. So we will populate the respective data across all these dimensions. And then Planning and Development Department can sort districts, can rank districts and tehsils from the worst to the best, so to say, and then allocate resources accordingly to prevent future crises. So if a district, let's say, is vulnerable in terms of climate change, then more resources should go for climate change to that district. Back, please. Can you come back? Right. So similarly, if you can click on the hyperlink here, in COVID, we found that we didn't have data of informal workers. So on the left, it shows that the Prime Minister announced a package, a relief package of 200 billion rupees for daily wage workers. And on the right, just 28 days later, Federal Secretary Finance informed a parliamentary committee that they didn't have a mechanism to disburse this amount because they didn't have data of informal workers. Next slide here. And this exactly same is the case in Punjab. The Chief Minister of Punjab announced a package for informal workers of 10 billion rupees, but just 3 weeks later, same was the finding in Punjab also. Next slide, please. And so it is where SNG stepped in and we devised this mechanism. And this is a registration mechanism. And workers are, informal workers are now being registered by Labour Department in Punjab. Can we go back, please? The next is the establishment of Social Protection Fund. So whenever a crisis takes place, government has to come up with a chunk of money on an urgent basis because there is no reservoir of social protection, so to say. We found that in Punjab Social Protection Authority Act, there was a provision of the Social Protection Fund. And so we kind of helped the government to come up with a plan to establish this fund. This fund is under establishment now. It has already an allocation of the first 500 million rupees. It is going to be an endowment fund to start with. But as you can see, the fund will make investments. And in another 4 years' time, this fund will provide the opportunity for informal workers who are being registered under the previous initiative, Workers' Repository, to make voluntary contributions towards their social security. Back, please. And finally, there are a couple of more initiatives. I'll just go over these quickly because I'm nearing my 15 minutes allocated time. So this is the development of social protection markers for ADP, just to see what ADP schemes, annual development schemes, are pro-poor or can be regarded as social protection or welfare schemes. So there is a scorecard mechanism that we are using for it. Back, please. And finally, we are working in close collaboration with Punjab Social Protection Authority, whose CEO is here, to help roll out new programs. CEO herself will inform you, but I think it's remarkable that in the last 1 year alone, 4 new programs have been rolled out by Social Protection Authority, where SNG provided design support and SOPs for multi-sectoral collaboration. Next, please. So this is the last slide. I'll skip the entire cycle here because I have already discussed number 1, pre-COVID, what was pre-COVID, then the first wave of response. Governments came up with emergency packages, both federal and provincial. And then the third part of The recovery cycle is the ongoing where we are trying to build resilience by all these various initiatives that I just mentioned. I'll just speak about the post-recovery, the opportunity for future. And I think what we are looking forward to doing in collaboration with both provincial governments and with the federal government also is to divert attention from unconditional cash transfers to human development initiatives along a life cycle trajectory, because there are investments that need to be made across the life cycle. So investments in the first 2 years of a child's life to avert stunting and wasting, and then in early years of learning and youth program, etc. So what we are trying to now advocate is to move towards this life cycle approach. We are also trying to achieve a welfare mix so that federal government and provincial government as well as voluntary sector can come together, chip in their resources to run program mutually in collaboration with each other. There is a Russian program in which federal and provincial governments have already collaborated. Similarly, Kamyab Jawan program is being run with the help of voluntary sector. We have additional secretary of the federal government who will throw more light on it. And finally, there is a need to initiate programs of productive inclusion also, in which we are able to graduate people out of poverty and to make them economically active. So in Punjab and KP both, human development programs under the title of Punjab Human Capital Investment Project. I'll not go into the details because I'm sure CEO PSP is here. I shall speak more about it, but there's a need to develop human capital so that people can fight against their poverty themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suhail Anwar. So Dr. Suhail Anwar, highlighting the social protection responses during the COVID and proposing a holistic social vulnerability index, workers repository, and highlighting the dire need for multi-tiered response to emerging vulnerabilities. So now, before we move on sequentially to our distinguished panelists, we have with us the Executive Director, STPI, Dr. Abid Qiyum Suleri. Dr. Abid, we would request you for a few introductory remarks before we move on with our panelist discussion. Sure, sir. Sure, sure. So now, before we actually discuss the core objective of complementarities and synergies and the alignment between federal and provincial authorities, there's another subject that needs attention, that is the digital footprint. We have with us Mr. Nadeem Hussain, the founder of Easy Paisa and CEO Planet N Group of Companies. So Nadeem, I have a very pertinent question for you. You are the founder of the celebrated Easy Paisa, that is the medium of social protection rollout at an unprecedented level throughout Pakistan. So my question to you is about the digital footprint of social protection over time and the latest addition of progressive elements by SARS emergency cash during COVID, such as limited mandate account with built-in saving wallet, the over-the-counter transactions, the transition to mobile wallets. So are we on the wrong side of the tech and touch spectrum in social protection, and where we are actually giving tools to beneficiaries with very low financial and digital literacy? Or is this exactly what is needed, where they learn by the hit and trial mechanism or learning by doing, because we are a very tech savvy nation? So your take on the digital footprint of social protection over time, and how do you see this? Because you have actually founded this Easy Paisa, that is the main medium. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faria, for inviting me. Esteemed panelists, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Dr. Faria, I'm going to respond to your question in the second half of my 15 minutes. I'm going to spend the first 15 minutes talking about some of the changes that happened as a result of COVID on the digital footprint and on digital Pakistan because they're very relevant to all what the policymakers are talking about here. Obviously, COVID led to major problems as far as economic activity was concerned. The government provided various interventions to help, overcome that problem. But we also had some very positive things happening as a result of COVID. And you'll ask what? The Digital Pakistan program accelerated. People who were not previously using digital means to do anything started working on the digital side, and the knowledge and the practice of digital work. And I'm going to give you examples of health tech, ed tech, fintech, dark stores, last mile, all things we thought were going to take 5 to 7 years to happen, got accelerated. And the people who are, in the social protection program, I mean, if you look at the poverty scorecard, there's some people you just have to provide funding for, but there is a segment of people you can migrate beyond that by using the tools that Dr. talked about, and I'm sure the other policy people will talk about. Pakistan is a cash society. We have 7.2 trillion rupees in circulation. It will take us a long time unless we have an event like India where currency, changes or notes changes. Otherwise, we will remain a cash society. There are many reasons for that. People are comfortable with cash. Right now, doing a digital transaction is far more expensive than doing a cash transaction. So there's no real incentive to do a digital transaction unless you belong to a certain socio-economic strata where time value for money is higher than the taxes that are associated with this. There's also this huge concern of people that they start going digital. It will lead to being caught in the tax net. But let me give you some very clear examples of what happened as a result of COVID as far as the digital footprint was concerned. We all know there's a huge imbalance between the number of doctors we have and the number of patients. And you start going to the rural areas, this becomes even more pronounced. Right now, there are close to 20 million people in Pakistan who use telehealth. These are people calling on a helpline, just getting a diagnosis. And, in one company that we are associated with, close to 20% of the calls are from the rural area, from young females talking about hygiene problems, which they've never had the ability to talk to anybody in their near, background. So COVID accelerated the ability of people to start using technology to get health access. Now, with that, people started giving online prescriptions, started organizing doctor visits at home. So this is one of the things I'm talking about, which COVID helped accelerate. Same thing happened in e-education. When schools closed down, a plethora of schools started imparting knowledge on a digital basis. Now imagine in the first case, somebody living in a rural area with no doctors in sight, being able to talk to a consultant, which they would never have access to. Or in the second case, in e-education, again, schools using the national curriculum, not talking about tuition, national curriculum being imparted on a digital basis to people in rural areas. So I'm talking about spending some time to tell you what the positive things that took place in the digital journey of Pakistan. It actually accelerated. Now, coming back to your question, because I'm conscious of the time I have, I'll narrate a story. I was with Salman Taseer, the ex-governor of Punjab, and we were having dinner, and he said, "Aajkal mujhe postman ki, vacancy, postman ki jagah bahut recommendations aa rahi hai postman banne ke liye." मैंने कहा, postman किसको बनना है? It's a tough life. That's the time when BISP payments were paid through the Pakistan Post Office. And obviously there were many leakages happening at the time when physical payment was made by the postman to the BISP beneficiaries. BISP obviously then automated and moved on to a restricted wallet that was created by the State Bank of Pakistan, and money started being pushed into a wallet. And I'll come back to your question, is this the right thing to do or not? But firstly, just to remind you, this account is restricted. You can only take money out of it. You can't use this wallet for anything else. And I think that's a problem which ought to be looked at. Now, if you have a social payment system, you need three things. I mean, those are three pillars. One, it has to be accessibility. Where is the funding, the money that you're going to take out come from? 15,500 branches of Pakistani banks in Pakistan, bulk of them in the urban areas. 12,500 ATMs, bulk of them in the urban areas. As we start going rural, the ability of commercial banks to disperse funds gets far and few between. You get into KPK, you get into FATA, you get into parts of Balochistan, banks that, those are frontier territories for banks. That's where somebody like Easy Paisa with agents provided assistance, because these are 90,000 Kiryana stores who can make payments out. So accessibility is key, and I think BISP has to a large extent has cracked the accessibility issue, that when you push money into a restricted account, they know where to take it out. Second thing is robustness. As the number of beneficiaries of BISP increase, the system that the banks are using has to be very robust. But I look at robustness from a different perspective. How secure is the system of cybersecurity? If the largest commercial banks in Pakistan can get hacked, if the largest organizations can get hacked, how much money is the government spending on the database that BISP itself has, or how much money are the providers of BISP beneficiaries spending in securing this database? It's not an issue about this data being put on the dark net. I mean, these people are low down the poverty score. It's just an issue of dignity and the name of these people being out in the market. One of the things I learned in Easy Paisa foremost was, remember, I spent 27 years in Citigroup, never worked at the bottom of the pyramid, was these are potential customers who expect to be treated with dignity and fairness. The only difference is they're not capable of buying a bottle of tomato sauce. They want a sachet. So their needs are very similar, except the magnitude of the need is much smaller. And when you address their problem, you have to come down to the accessibility, because time value for them is very high. They don't have people to pay the bills. They have to leave their shop or their place of work to actually go and do the transaction. How convenient is that? So accessibility. Secondly is robustness. And thirdly is how easy in terms of integration are you making this intervention that you're doing in part of their lives. Coming back to your question, is pushing money into a wallet the right way to go? Because we're talking about people being financially illiterate, at the time. Yes, there is, I think, some concern. But I found people, when I was dealing in Tamil Microfinance Bank, lending money to people just above the poverty scorecard, very, very conscious of the value of money. So they didn't have to have an MBA to understand finances. They knew what the income was. They knew what the expenses were. They could work out, but if you were charging interest rate, what the implied interest rate was. So in my view, people, as you go down the economic chain, firstly, are better customers. Our default rate was far less than any commercial bank, but also understand the value of money. So just saying, they're necessarily financially illiterate. Now, maybe for complex transactions they are, but we're talking about a deposit and a payment. So typically, I think that's not would be my concern necessarily, that we're pushing money into a wallet and people don't know how to use it. But my concern is that this wallet is restricted. You're forcing people to take cash out. So rather than helping a conversion from cash to digital, you're just doing digital cash, because the only thing you can do is withdraw that. Why not build use cases into that for which the money is being withdrawn? The biggest use case is just purchases at the Kiryana store where they're withdrawing this money. Why can't they use that wallet to make purchases at that Kiryana store? What will that do? It will reduce the incidence of cash that comes out and then goes back out again. It provides you data as to how that particular BISP customer is utilizing the funds. So maybe you can make more interventions subsequently in assisting them, because data is going to drive essentially in my view, most of the interventions that you do. And the more data you have, the better off you're going to be. In the use cases that you create, you need to understand that Pakistanis, especially as you go down the bottom of the pyramid, don't save in banks. The number of bank accounts we have may be 65 million, but the active bank accounts and duplication of those bank accounts bring that down to maybe 20, 30 million. It's great to say that we've got very high penetration of banking account, but I would say what the active banking accounts, and an active bank account is viewed as one transaction in 60 days. So it's a very generous, assessment of what an active bank account. So we are very, very still low on financial inclusion active accounts. So make this particular account, look at the use cases that the BISP beneficiaries use. So, and build that into that account. My question is, why doesn't BISP open its own wallet? Why are they restricting themselves to using the third-party bank's wallet? It can get an EMI license from the state bank and have its own wallet, and then it can provide the provision and have the data itself rather than rely on third parties and their systems breaking down. Create your own wallet. And in that wallet, let me give you two more use cases. How do Pakistanis save? Bulk of Pakistanis save in three ways. Gold. I mean, $8 to $10 million of gold is imported every year. 99% of that goes into gold ornaments. It's a measure of saving, and it's an emergency requirement where you can then sell in a scenario when you have emergency cash requirement. Why not create fractional gold? Allow them to buy 10 rupees of gold at any one time with the buy offer spread, and educate them that you can get 10 rupees of gold and you can save in gold. Given the kind of inflation we're going to experience this year, it's going to be great hedge against inflation. Rural people save in animals. Fractionalize the animal. Why can't they have one cow being owned by 20 people, 30 people in the cities who want to make a contribution towards these people? And somebody who already has 2 cows can own a 3rd cow because they can never afford a cow otherwise, or a buffalo. And you can create linkages where the milk that is created can be sold, pre-sold. Committees is how all of us says. How many banking institutions, the people have come out with BCs or committee solutions, which is what the informal mechanism of saving. 25% of people in Pakistan save through committees. So build these in your wallet that BISP creates. And now I'm going to make a radical, thing. There's hybrid smartphones which go for 4,000 rupees. If I was running BISP, I would provide a hybrid smartphone to every BISP beneficiary and build in the solutions I want in the phone, not for free, for 5,000. The telcos, if you do a 1-year contract, will give this phone for free. You go to Europe, you never pay for your phone, you build in a contract. So make a restricted contract, get them to contribute something, provide information that you're talking about, dissemination of education, information through the smartphone, because most females, which are, well, all BISP beneficiary females, don't have a smartphone. In this area, there's one smartphone in the house, and that's owned by the male head. A 3,000 to 4,000 rupee smartphone blocked in with the SIM for the female beneficiary can go a very long way. So I think I have 2 minutes left. I'm just going to wrap this up and say, treat the BISP beneficiaries as customers with dignity. Doesn't mean you have to exploit them. Provide use cases for the services they require. And the biggest issue is fractional. Reduce the quantum of the need that they have, whether it's gold, whether it's BC, whether it's, I'm just giving you a saving element. You can provide that in insurance as well. Make them feel that they're your customer. Give them dignity. And these people will pay, they will be to a large extent, my own experience is, better, returners of funds than your corporates or the consumer market. I always end my talks with a share which I think inspires me, so hopefully it inspired you. And I'm talking about the BISP beneficiaries. And this is Hashim Raza Saab's share. क्यों कर संभालते हमें वो ना खुदा जो खुद साहिल की ओर से भंवर देखते रहे, मंजिल की राह में आबला पा उठ खड़े हुए और शह सवार गुबारे सफर देखते रहे. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nadeem Saab. Thank you very much for a very enlightening discussion. So Nadeem Hussain talking about the digital spectrum in Pakistan and how COVID accelerated the digital maturity metrics, talking about the main fundamentals of accessibility, robustness of banking sector, and understanding the magnitude of the needs of the disadvantaged segments. So now coming to the fundamental question of complementarities, alignment between federal and provincial platforms, we would now move on to the federal government, and I would request Mr. Captain Retired Syed Ahmed Nawaz, my apologies, Additional Secretary, Poverty Alleviation and Social Safety Division. Captain Syed, we are interested if you can highlight the COVID-19 scenario and the response of the federal government. And especially we are keenly interested in the federal and poverty alleviation and social safety division as a platform to coordinate with the provinces for the implementation of social protection. So how do you see this alignment between the provincial and federal entities from this platform?
Thank you, Dr. Priya. Honorable Chair, honorable guest panelists, ladies and gentlemen, Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. Conventionally, first response to any kind of catastrophe, may it be earthquake, river flooding, urban inundation, or dengue, used to be in the form of relief, rescue, and finally rehabilitation, provided by local councils, police stations, that means street level bureaucrats, revenue officers, assistant commissioners, and deputy commissioners, signifying a bottom-up approach, and the response would continue to move up with the magnitude expanding. COVID was a unique case. The lower tiers of the government were clueless about the magnitude, direction, or likely outcome of the pandemic. And the response started from federation and traveled down to the lower tiers of the government, a top-down approach. Initial response to COVID-19 characterized by misinformation, disbelief, and dissonance of narratives. I vividly recall, and I believe most of you would remember the ads running on national media that in fact an infected person touched the knob of the door, a tap of water, and everything starts turning green. So this kind of misinformation led to disbelief amongst the people. Use of green color to signify infection in a country like Pakistan was probably a bad choice. And then the spread was so monumental that most of the people thought that nothing could be done against such an enemy. So it led to apathy and indifference amongst the people. The situation was further confounded by dissonance of narratives. Prime Minister of Pakistan initially ruled out nationwide lockdown because of the reason that it would starve the poor to death. There was an initial indecision to close down the borders, especially Balochistan. Sindh was the first to opt for lockdown, and it was followed by Punjab. Then AP and Balochistan imposed smart lockdowns. Conflicting messages emanating from political statements on the government side as well as opposition, sermons of the clergy coming from members, court rulings, and media discourse probably thoroughly confused the nation. The Federation of Pakistan consists of federal government, provincial governments, regional governments, and district governments, starting from micro, meso to micro level, which is the level of service delivery. But unluckily, we are still grappling with the question of optimal level of devolution customized to suit our needs. Federal government, as its first response, allocated an amount of a budgetary allocation of about 1 trillion rupees to deal with the pandemic. The exact figures could be different based upon different exchange rates. Immediately, a SARS emergency cash program was launched, which provided 12,000 rupees to each family and covered about 15 million families. We continued with the unconditional cash transfer programs and several satellite programs besides this emergency cash transfers. This enabled us to introduce a digital inclusion because the response to SMS service launched for registration and a SaaS portal launched for registration of the beneficiaries received about 17 million applications. The Industries and Production Division launched a Prime Minister's relief package for small and medium enterprises. It covered 95% of industrial consumers with maximum government support, a payment of 3 months electricity bills to the maximum of 450,000. 72% of commercial consumers were also covered under the package with a maximum limit of rupees 100,000. Then lately, government has come up with Kamyab Pakistan program and targeted commodity subsidy program. I would like to say a few words about the latest targeted subsidy program. In the company of economists, shifting from any suggestion or proposal to shift from cash transfers to commodity-based subsidy probably sound illogical. But what we expect to gain out of it is a shift from untargeted to targeted subsidies, a socio-cultural transformation shifting from cash-based transactions to digital transactions, financial inclusion and bankability of lower strata of the society, and finally, formalization of some informal sectors of the economy. What has been the outcome of reluctant lockdowns, selective opening up of economy, smart lockdowns followed by micro smart lockdowns? Luckily, it worked for us and we didn't face situations like India and Iran. We've heard enough about the provincial social efforts, but the third tier of government was missing. That's the local government. If they had been there, it would have enabled the government to ensure communication of credible messaging in the face of chaos and confusion, access to empowered citizens through their local representative councillors, integration of political, financial, and administrative parts, probably at the district level, and emergency preparedness in collaboration with all the stakeholders, specifically targeting mothers, imams, and teachers, self-help and community-based resilience, which is a hallmark of Pakistani societies in the face of adversities, and institutional convergence to eliminate overlaps. And finally, if nothing else, at least agreement of 2 of the 3 tiers of the governments would have led to better results. Ladies and gentlemen, success of public policy management, that's formulation as well as implementation, is contingent upon stakeholders' perspectives analysis, that we need to know that how the stakeholders feel about something and how will they react to likely interventions. Then adoption of global best practices customized for local context to avoid reinvention of wheel. Socio-political buy-ins, that means stakeholders' acceptance and ownership of the public policy intervention. And finally, implementability with inherent flexibility for mid-course review and correction. All this leads to shared vision, which helps align the priorities, synergize the efforts, and maximize delivery outcome. And this could be developed through constitutional and legal structures, Council of Common Interest, National Economic Council, Planning Commission, political processes, parliamentary procedures and proceedings, inter and intra-party dialogues, communications, executive and administrative institutions working in harmony with each other, in communications going from top to bottom and vice versa, and finally media discourse taking place on the electronic as well as press media. Government of Pakistan lacked any multi-tiered shock responsive social protection system in Pakistan. So it was decided to leverage on the capabilities of Pakistan military, and National Command and Operations Center was established. It provided for an interprovincial dialogue and development of consensus and formalization of responses to various emerging situations and contingencies. So all these efforts are meant to develop a shared vision. It was a miss in the beginning, what started to develop in due course of time. And NCOC played a lead role in this effort. Ladies and gentlemen, shared vision remains elusive in the environment of political polarization, battle of vested interests and conflicting narratives, and finally, race for political mileage. That's what we faced in the initial stage of our response to COVID-19. But the things gradually started to settle down, and we were able to develop a coherent response to the changing situations and didn't face the situations like two of our neighboring countries, the other three, if you decide to include China. Finally, as they say, politics is the art of making impossible things possible. Likewise, politics and economics are inseparable. And bridges can be built in the worst of the circumstances, in the atmosphere of hatred and polarization. That's what ISAS is exactly doing. We are currently working for the development and launch of ISAS one window centers up to Tehsil level. That's in a way going to be a conduit to formalize the responses, develop the narratives, build consensus at at various levels of the government. And ISAR Social Assistance Act is also being pushed to provide for earmarked revenues, entitlements for the beneficiaries, and an organizational structure to carry out the purposes of the legislation. We are developing a cognitive API architecture for integration of all social assistance being provided to beneficiaries, and that will in a way integrate the ancillary organizations under the PASS division, and at a later stage it will lead to integration with the provincial governments and maybe the philanthropic organizations providing some kind of social assistance and emergency relief. We have already developed a database in the form of National Socioeconomic Registry to access the poor, targeted the people who are most in need of the relief packages, and we are going from a static national socioeconomic registry to a dynamic socioeconomic registry that will start automatically including and excluding the people or the beneficiaries. We are contemplating the development of NSCR for labor in the informal sectors of the economy. And finally, as indicated by my friend, we are working on a new payment system for the best beneficiaries. That's an overview of some of the interventions by the federal government. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Said Saab, for your perspective from as federal entity. Now we're going to take in a political perspective on the subject, and I would request Engineer Khurram Dastagir Khan for sir, your take on the subject, please.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I will begin by thanking SDPI and its Executive Director, Dr. Abid Suleri, for very kindly inviting me here this evening. I came practically as a student this evening to hear from experts about how the details of the service delivery and relief to people of Pakistan are being analyzed and managed, and how they could be improved. But of course, I was taken over, like many of you must have this evening, by the strife we see on the roads of Islamabad this evening, and the social / political strife that we saw 3 days ago in Sialkot. And of course, whenever one analyzes social and political strife, its roots almost always end up in intellectual confusion. And maybe, perhaps if I may be so bold, in our collective lack of courage to say what it is that we see in the streets of Islamabad this evening, and the barbarism we saw in Sialkot, and a few days earlier in my neighboring city of Wazirabad, next to Gujranwala, where I'm from. I don't want to make any political points this evening. I just want to bring forward my observation as a policy practitioner and a legislator, that it seems that most of our institutions of governance have reached their limits, and in fact have become obsolete and entirely inadequate to serve the people of Pakistan. So I'm hoping that SDPI and of course the illustrious experts that it always invites and asks to contribute will also look at this larger aspect of what is going on or what has caused the degradation in our institutions of governance. Yes, there are very small but substantive bright spots like the income support program and its now various offshoots that we see. But the larger question of how this country is going to be governed is head on because we seem to be, although it's a cliche, but I'll repeat it anyway because it is the truth. We are stuck in these vicious cycles of a very weak democracy followed by some hybrid mechanism, and in many cases, for nearly 4 decades, outright dictatorships. And we find ourselves in 2021 receding further from the rest of the world. The rest of the world, it seems, has passed us by. I do not abjure my small responsibility, having been in government and in parliament for this. But the fact is, and that is my request and hope from SDPI, and it's not only its very able members and staff and its distinguished guests, is for us occasionally to also look at how we are going to create new institutions. And apparently it is now a subject of institutional design. It is a subject of market design and how the state is going to play its part and whether the state itself has the capacity to deliver. While I was in government, I found the state capacity again to be grossly inadequate to whatever policy we wish to design. In fact, one of the principal restrictions on the conceptions of policy is the pathetic capacity of the state to deliver it. And again, I won't abjure my responsibility to have been part of it is not been able to do anything substantive to raise the capacity of the state to deliver to the people. But here we are in 2021 with nearly 220 million Pakistanis, again lost in the wilderness of how this country is to be governed and how it's to be kept together. So my appeal to the very distinguished audience and my panelists and experts is to guide us, who are the elected representatives of the people, of how we are going to design these institutions. Because income support program, yes, but maybe SDPI in its future gatherings can bring us the good news, at least, that if we have some parts of governments that are working and an analysis of how and why these are working. Because most of the government is, well, it is working, but it's not delivering. So these are the larger challenges. And of course, this question of Pakistan intellectual classes to reaffirm their commitment to democracy, however messy it is, and however dirty it might appear to you. Because if I may quote Amartya Sen, democracy is a universal value. And development is freedom. is part of the freedom that all people must have in order to fulfill their aspirations for themselves and their children. And it's these aspirations for ourselves and our children that I hear from my own constituents in Gujranwala. The people of this country are extremely afraid. They are apprehensive. They are scared of the future of their children and their economic prospects, their prospects as citizens. So all these questions I put to the table, and I hope that all the intelligent experts, well-read individuals, and of course, policy analysts will be able to answer for us so we can begin to redesign the Pakistani state, to retool it, to begin it to deliver to its people in this new, well, not so new century anymore. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Pakistan, Pindawar. I had to go, that's why I asked for this intervention. Thank you.
Very much, Khurram Saab. Thank you very much. Now, we have the pleasure of the company of Dr. Adil Malik joining us from Oxford University, UK. And Dr. Adil Malik will bring in a new perspective of the political economy of poverty reduction in Pakistan, something which is interlinked with the social protection mechanism. Dr. Adil Malik, can you hear us? Kindly, if Dr. Adil can be taken on screen by IT.
Hello.
Yes, Dr. Adil, we can hear you.
Yes. Would you like me to start? Hello. Can I start presenting?
Sure, Dr. Adil, sure.
Okay. Sorry about this. I think I had stepped out to the washroom, so I probably missed the initial. So how much time would you like me to speak?
We would appreciate if we have a time allocation of 7 to 8 minutes per panelist.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I think what I'm going to say here is that I'm going to offer some insights based on my own area of expertise or what I study in. It's basically thinking about the way in which politics and economics intersect. A lot of the issues about poverty reduction are obviously not just about supporting the poor through cash transfers or giving them better facilities. It's also about the larger political economy structures are typically designed in ways that disadvantage the poor. So my reflections really would be in that regard. Now, I must start by admitting that Pakistan has made immense progress in terms of expanding its social network regime. So I remember when I used to work at Mahbubul Haq, a human development center in the late 1990s, coming straight out of the grad school. A lot of talk about poverty reduction was really just health and education, with very little conception about social protection. Fast forward 2008 onwards, we've seen massive expansion of our social protection regime. In particular, the expansion of the Benazir Income Support Program, and then using the same platform and developing it further through the SARS program. One of the things that we've done really well in the wake of COVID is to expand that social network regime and extend it to sort of relatively, people who are in the informal sector. Now, all of that is right, but I think we need, when we think about sort of poverty reduction, we need to take a broader, more structural view. All across the world, much of the literature that we have come across on Latin America, on Africa, some of the drivers of poverty are really structural in nature. So there's a great book by Stephen Derlauf and Sam Bowles. It's called The Poverty Traps. And one of the key chapters in that book is about institutional poverty traps, the way in which the particular configurations of economic and political power can entrench poverty, in the sense that the poor are poor because they lack assets, because they lack a particular threshold of income in order to be more mobile. More recently, for example, a big RCT in India showed that one of the impacts of the cash transfer programs was really in terms of making the poor more mobile. We find that a lot of the poor people in rural areas lack mobility in part because of those structural characteristics. So in the sort of next 4 minutes or so, what I'm going to do is to give you a set of sort of recommendations which we need to consider and open up the floor for discussion. The first, what I'm going to do is basically give those broader recommendations and then end with a recent study that I've done on Pakistan. And that is particularly looking at the role of shrine-based religious elites. But let me start with the broader. If you are thinking about the poor, one big area for the poor, particularly the rural poor, is agricultural procurement. If you're a small farmer, you need access to bardana, you need access to public procurement. A lot of those procurement bags are not directly available to small farmers. They are intermediaries, a set of intermediaries who enable the farmers access to those, right? And there are all set of power relationships in there, in the sense that those who provide these procurement bags are typically also people who provide credit to the poor or the small farmer. And therefore, these power relationships are extremely rife in those rural areas. And how do you really reduce the role of the intermediaries or provide direct access to small farmers? So I think we now have the technological capability through NADRA, through ESAS and other platforms. We need a more well-documented database of small farmers and then start thinking about credit programs, procurement bags, so on and so forth. Now, I'm not up to speed as far as some of the recent government initiatives are concerned, but I think some such program has already been thought through, particularly in terms of credit to the rural poor. Now, in terms of credit, I think there's a real scope for expanding microfinance, Islamic microfinance, Islamic financial instruments in rural areas. A lot of the good work that Akhuwat and other partners and Islamic financial institutions have done are very much focused on urban areas. They're focused on the urban poor. But the rural poor is still, in large parts of our country, particularly parts of Sindh and parts of South Punjab, are really indebted and beholden to dependent structures of credit within the places they're situated, and usually is rife even to this day. Therefore, Islamic finance has an important role to play. I think what we also need to do is to reorganize the Zarai Taraqqiyati Bank. Now, I know Shaukat Tareen Saab himself has been leading that initiative, but we need to have some proper mechanism through which credit is provided. Now, existing state institutions, particularly the Zarai Taraqqiyati Bank, the ZTBL, has been favoring large landowners. If you were to do a forensic audit of the ZTBL, you will find that much of the loan that these institutions have extended has gone to the large farmers, and they've also defaulted. Many of them are very politically connected as well. And so I think the issue of credit is crucial. The other thing that the rural poor, and I'm really concentrating more on the rural poor, is land. A lot of the land is in the hands, obviously, of either very big landlords, or although land is getting fragmented, but the rural poor has very precarious access to land. Much of the poverty, study after study has shown us, is concentrated amongst people who are landless, the landless poor. Now, this is where you need a new social economic bargain in Pakistan. The time has come for that, because we've, for a long period of time, we've talked about land reforms. We've talked about the way in which, land is, has been fragmented. The large landed elite is no longer powerful, and that's certainly true, but there's still huge land inequality in Pakistan. And although we have not implemented effective land reforms, land continues to be granted to rich, privileged, powerful segments of society. I think there's a time has come that we sit down and analyze the practice of awarding rural productive land to bureaucratic intermediaries. And let me say, also the generals. I think we need to stop that practice of giving land to bureaucrats, civil and military, or to indeed political elites. And that would be the first step of the land reform, right? That we no longer give, in Punjab, for example, one of the former chief secretaries told me, I don't know how true it is, but about 68,000 acres of land every year is allocated to these bureaucratic intermediaries, which is developed then and passed on to effectively sort of absentee landlords who sit in Rawalpindi, Islamabad, Lahore. They go around to Punjab and have hired people to work for themselves. These are bureaucrats who are not from that region as such. And then there's preferential access to water for these people. So I think what we need to do there is really change the very way the state deals with land, right? And so that means we need to go beyond cash transfer programs and really think about productive assets and think about how those productive assets are distributed. There's a lot more I can talk about that. So for example, Malaysia has a great experience, which is called the FELDA, which is the Federally Administered Land Development Authority. They pool these different parcels of land and provide access to the poor to use that land along with input, seed, technical assistance, agricultural extension support services, water, etc. And it's a great way to model that. So we need to create those sort of create a new pact. And I'm sure that if a real discussion is started by any political government, the military stakeholders could be convinced that, look, we have now come into a point where voluntarily the military, in the larger national interest of the country, should stop the practice of giving land to retired generals and brigadiers, agricultural land in rural areas. This was a colonial practice. The time for it has gone. Now, another important structural political economy intervention is in the access is in terms of access to water. Now, in Punjab, much of the water, the whole irrigation system, works to the favor of big farmers, whether they are tailenders or whether they are upstream in terms of the water distribution system. But particularly when water comes downstream, the large farmers have a clear sort of advantage in terms of accessing water. There's a lot of systematic theft and leakage, misuse of canal water, where powerful lobbies are able to appoint the irrigation officials, are able to use the system, what we call, they use all these places, you'll find mogas, water is filtering through. Now, what we need to do, again, you could do a technological intervention, and there were previous interventions in the 1970s, whether it was the suggestion to introduce telemetry system, whether it was other technological interventions, those could be implemented to have a more fairer distribution of water, and that would really be important for small farmers. In terms of health, I think, again, the government is doing, undertaking some steps, but again, survey after survey has suggested that out-of-pocket expenditures are a big health-related emergency. As soon as there's a health emergency in the household, the whole income provision is changed, right? And these are huge shocks. If we can create some kind of an insurance scheme for these poor people, it's great. Education system, I'm not going to talk a whole lot because I'm sure there's a lot already talked about, and we know what educational interventions we need, but we need really a big educational emergency in the country. And again, we need to think beyond a sort of classic technical paradigms about educational expansion. One of the things we've learned over time is that societies that have expanded mass education to far corners of the country, they have done so not through just the education ministries or schools or a set of donor-funded educational initiatives. They have done this as part of a nation-building exercise. You have experiences from Costa Rica all the way down to parts of Africa. You find that educational expansion is often used as a nation-building exercise where a new political resource is needed to expand access to education. So again, that is one concrete area where political economy is crucial. Today, when it comes to poor, which is that the poor needs to be given some agency as well. You know, today is the day of information age, right? It's the information age. We need better representation and collective mobilization of the poor. That is very important. Now, when it comes to, again, I'm focusing more on the rural poor in this presentation today. There are a whole set of issues for urban poor as well, but we can come to that later if need be. But when it comes to the rural poor, think about Punjab and Sindh. I mean, who are the interest groups that represent the interests of the farmers? Are there collective action or collective mobilization vehicles? It's like the Farmer Association of Pakistan, FAP. Now, go and search on the Farmers Association of Pakistan's website. They're all large landowners. You know, the Haqqanis, the Qurayshis, the Gilanis. I mean, it's the usual lot. They've always formulated, rural policies when it comes to Pakistan poor. So we need counter bodies, and perhaps donors need to fund those as well. We often talk about sugarcane growers, the plight of the sugarcane growers. We need to empower the alternative lobbies of these sugarcane growers. We need a collective organization for them. We need to find ways to get their voice in PTV, in radio, in Pembra. So part of our poverty reduction strategy should be greater voice for the poor. And you have seen this literally last week when so many people in Gwadar have come down, women and children coming out. Now, in a way, this is very positive because they're coming out for their basic rights, like their, access to water, access to fishing rights. That is a very healthy sign for any society where there are new bargaining structures that can really negotiate with the ruler, provide them information about what is lacking, what they need. And that bargaining structure can be really, really useful for the poor. So when we think about poverty reduction, my plea is not just to think about, a cash grant or the poor need some support in terms of, some extra income. That's all very useful. I'm not downplaying the importance of it, but the poor also need voice in the system. They also need new forums to collectively organize. And one such thing, obviously, is devolution. Every government has come and promised devolution, but they have not. And it's partly because of the same brokers who are sitting in every political party who don't want to open up the space for political contestation. Again, a lot of social science research by people like Professor Ali Chima, Shandana Mohammad, and others have shown that despite all the challenges that we face in terms of the efficacy of devolution, it still provides a great informational tool to represent the needs of the poor. There are new actors who enter the political playing field. There are new types of actors who will bring competition to politics, and especially to politics of social service delivery. And finally, my the sort of last point is in terms of taxation. Look, Pakistan's tax structure is hugely regressive. Yesterday, Shahbaz Rana carried a very good story about the top 10 items that carry huge import taxes. Many of these are essential items like, oil that people consume, cooking oil, and you have the fuel, food items. Now, effectively, we might think of this in terms of sort of technical statistics. Here, there's greater share of taxes being collected from indirect taxes. And then there are other sectors which are tax exempt. But if I look at this issue from a broader political economy standpoint, I find that our tax structure is not only regressive, it is actually taking away incomes or resources from the poor. So it's basically extracting from the poor through indirect taxes and distributing it to the rich through tax exemptions. Agriculture is largely tax exempt. Capital gains are very low in terms of property, right? All these big fancy colonies that we have in major urban centers, they're hugely undertaxed. So what does it mean? It means that effectively we are overtaxing the poor and taking those resources away and distributing them to the rich. I remember reading a very old study, but it's become really more important today, of Dr. Ahmed Kamal of Dr. A.R. Kamal of PIDE, where he talked about, he calculated the tax burden on the rich and the poor, and he found that the tax burden on the poor is hugely positive. The relative tax burden on the poor is actually negative. What does that mean? It basically means that there is that sort of redistribution that is taking place. Now, new discussions on poverty, and I know that there's some political leaders sitting today in our session today as well. New discussions about poverty have to go beyond the traditional civil-military divide, because this distributive equilibrium that I talked about, taking money from the poor and distributing it through tax exemptions to the rich, has been maintained. This distributive arrangement has been maintained under all political parties, under all military regimes. Whether there's individual X, Y, or Z in government, the same status quo remains. So we want today a people's movement in Pakistan, and the civil society need to speak with members of PTI, PMLN, People's Party, other political claimants, the military establishment. What are you going to do about this regressive taxation structure? What commitments will you give us? The nature of the debate in Pakistan needs to shift beyond individuals, Nawaz Sharif, Imran Khan, Zardari, to this distributive setup, which all these political parties have maintained. Believe me. In fact, curiously enough, the one government that has really tried, it might have failed on many accounts, that the one government that he has really genuinely tried to fix the tax system is the PTI, right? Now, we don't know whether this is successful so far or not, but at least in terms of the priority that it deserves. So this topic is very close to my heart. I can keep on speaking for long, but I really wanted to close in my discussion with these two cents that, look, the poor need charity, yes, but the poor need more than the charity. They need an egalitarian economic system which changes fundamentally the rules of the game in which resources are generated and distributed in our country. The entire economic system is anti-poor. Within that system, you can try and protect the poor, which is the absolute minimum we should do, and we should congratulate all the economic managers and respective governments for doing that. We should strengthen that even further, but let's also talk about the anti-poor nature of the economic system, and that requires not just technocratic reform, it requires a new social bargain between the rich and the poor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adil Malik, for your perspective, academic perspective on political economy of poverty reduction in Pakistan. We are honored, we are joined by the Honorable Provincial Minister for Punjab for Finance, Mr. Makhdoom Hashim Jawanba. So thank you very much for taking up time and joining this plenary session. We are grateful. So we would like to have your take on the provincial response to COVID-19, its magnitude, and in the face of, from the perspective of crisis resilient social protection, what are the takeaways and learnings, and what needs to be integrated in future? What could have been done differently? So your views on the COVID-19 response. Thank you.
Ji, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Thank you for having me as part of this August gathering. Um, so before we get on to the COVID response, it seems like the conversations and the discussions today have been quite meaningful. I was reading about a lot of very eminent names which have participated here. And I would just like to say that the last 3 years, or slightly more than that now, there has been a philosophical structural shift from how we perceive development. So from the typical brick and mortar infrastructure centric approach to a more human development centric approach is what the PTI government has uh, been working on, and this is something which we hope the new meaning of development carries a human quotient to it rather than just creating structures. And I think in terms of size of the pie, the allocation of the slice of the pie, which now goes into the social sectors, predominantly health and education, you would see that there has been a significant shift. And in doing so, we feel that we are making the right investments. As an economic manager of this province, when I was handed the reins of finance in 2018 and going through the PTI's philosophy, I strongly believed that, I strongly still believe that the sort of infrastructure development aspect can be catered for through the private sector. So while we go and start developing cities, we provide basic amenities, focus on those in the developing countries, and then we create an environment where private sector can come in and public-private partnership can handhold and take on further aspects of development. So we can shift our focus predominantly to the sectors which are in dire requirement and for our basic requirements and fulfillment of our SDG goals. So I would just like to talk about a bit more about health and education. In education, given that we have limited resources, we are a developing country. So what we have tried to do is we have tried to maximize our existing infrastructure. So if you take any government's tenure, the usual parameter for upgradation of schools and the amount of money which is spent on one school could only at any given time yield around 1,000 to 1,200 upgradations. And what we saw was a huge impact, especially when it came to the graduation from primary school to middle school. We were able to see a lot of out of school children, especially in that bracket. So if a government is spending its resources and only managing around 1,000 schools in a 5-year tenure, you will not be able to arrest this issue. So this is the only government which has gone about in using the same infrastructure and using upgradation and announced upgradation of its entire 24 odd thousand primary schools to middle schools by bringing in evening classes or late afternoon classes in the same very structure. So what we are spending on is a small amount of what it would cost to build an entire new school using the same facilities, employing more teachers, having another teacher teach from grade 6 to 8, and especially for girls' education, we feel this is a major, major initiative in terms of ensuring that out of school children are reduced. And this number, I feel, will trickle down, inshallah, going forward. So this is one of the key initiatives which I wanted to talk about as far as education is concerned. We will talk about social protection here, but I think the biggest social protection tool which is coming about in Pakistan, and this I feel is going to be the main game changer as far as PTI's government and its legacy is concerned, and that is the universal health insurance in Punjab. So 110 million people live in this populous province. We have a certain number of public health facilities. If we look at the sort of investments which we're making right now. We're looking at the largest inclusion of additional public sector health facilities across the breadth and width of Punjab. But having said that, there will always be limitations to how the public sector can cater to it. And as was being mentioned earlier also, in terms of uh, the type of elasticity which we have and the income levels which are in Pakistan and in Punjab, a health shock can really create and send ripples across a family. And it can really, for a family, it can push people a lot under the poverty line. So the biggest thing which we thought we could do in terms of ushering in an entirely new health philosophy was to ensure everybody in Punjab. So by the start of next year, which is now less than a month away, we hope that we'll be inshallah able to announce and in fact launch the universal health insurance program. I personally feel that with enabling, with empaneling private sector hospitals, we will be able to provide a decent start to a revolutionary program, and hopefully over the next 1 2 years, as we go through our learning process, this would really turn the tide in terms of our health indicators as well. We have been able to divert our resources for this very large initiative which we are taking. But we feel personally that this is well worth the investment which is being made into this sector. Having said that, I would now like to focus on the other social protection elements. One, this recent post-COVID hike also. This inflationary pressures, the way the consumption patterns globally have changed and how inflation has hit Pakistan, predominantly our import, we're an import-centric nation. So what we feel the larger issues and what we have used to resolve them is that we have now the data of our populace. We have improved fintech solutions. So be it in the COVID response or now, even in this last 1 year, our response to COVID related, be it inflationary matters, be it health related expenditure, we really feel that we have been able to gather that data where we can respond in a much more timely fashion. So one of the things which we are now doing is that this inflationary hike we are wanting to cushion, and the government has in principle decided to provide up to a certain level of the poverty line, the PMT score we're catering for, which in fact for Punjab is over 50% of its populace, is that we will be providing 1,000 rupees a month for a shorter term period. So at least every household is able to mitigate some of the expense which has been created due to this inflation. So what I'm trying to communicate with all of you here is that we have introduced a more social centric approach to how development and how public finances should be spent. Some of these schemes are graduating in nature. Some of these are more consumption related. But we overall feel that this is the way forward of how the government should be behaving in the provincial sphere also, and trying to make their agenda more social centric in nature. This is one of the larger things, the contours which I wanted to talk about. The specific ask from me was more of a COVID-centric response when this crisis, when this pandemic actually hit us. This was a pandemic, I think, in terms of the learning curve, globally, all of us were on the same page, but thankfully, in Pakistan, I feel that we did proactively take a lot of measures and were able to somewhat cushion the brunt as compared to other countries where it lingered on for longer. Uh, it wasn't an easy decision. No decision related to COVID has been easy for us, because at any given time you were weighing either an economic loss versus a potential loss of human life. So in both ways, in a country with our level of poverty levels, this decision is not an easy one to make. But on the finance side, just not focusing on the social protection element of things, but just rather wearing the cap of an economic manager, we thought that livelihood is very important. And this gave us a moment to somewhat reflect upon a few ideas which used to crop up, but we weren't able to implement. And we never, and in the regular environment, the need or the inertia behind them was not so strong. So let me give you an example. So in the Punjab Revenue Authority, we decided to lower the tax rate from the base rate of 16% to 5% on 20 plus items of various sectors, just to see that let's try and focus on expanding the base rather than focusing on a higher taxation rate. In addition to that, we also gave a reprieve of almost 56 billion in total in a tax relief budget to sectors, especially which were either COVID hit or which could be labor intensive once the economy was going to go on the rebound, once the wave would subside. And I tell you, that actually proved to be one of the best decisions this government has made, because we were able to have a significant bounce back, which is one of the reasons that this province, which makes up half of Pakistan, contributed significantly for Pakistan moving from a negative growth rate to, in fact, an almost 4%. Social centric approach I've already talked about, but in social protection, I feel that Punjab, we contributed to the federal government's program of providing emergency relief. B, we wanted to incentivize our workers which were working in this sector, so they feel that they are doing this amazing job, and the nation supports them not only morally, emotionally, but also that there is a financial incentive for them to be out there and to ensure that the people of this province do have those medical services, that they are forthcoming, that they are going to take this issue heads on. So yes, we had all those incentives in place and a social protection program. So we're one of the provinces which started its own Punjab Social Protection Authority as well. And we went for the larger marginalized sectors, for example, the transgender, the ACID victims, the widowers, the old age, the senior citizens. So we wanted to cater to schemes which were specific to the larger segments which have over time been marginalized or are slightly looked over. So I think it overall, in terms of trying to get your new bearings, I feel that what we have set in motion in terms of what development truly means. Is it a large construct of a building? Is it something you can see from 5 miles? Or is it actually investing in your people? I think this thought is now very much there in our planning, in our development, in our narrative. It resonates within our cabinet, within the bureaucracy which is working with us. So I hope this paradigm shift of what development really means is here to stay, and that we continue to invest in our human development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hashim Jawan Bakht. Extremely grateful for your time and your perspective on the initiatives by the provincial government and the upcoming initiatives like Universal Health Insurance Program and the social centric approaches that you just mentioned. Extremely grateful. Now moving on quickly to
unemployed due to these limited economic activities. So though there was this political will available and government of Punjab made that 10 billion rupees COVID fund, support fund available, but they had no means, we had no means of distributing that 10 billion rupees on our own. So we had to collaborate with the federal government. We had to request them to distribute our funds through their own means. You see, federal government was better off. They had this data with them, and then they leveraged on systems where they could check the claims, counter check the claims through the administrative data available, and they did this quick wealth profiling, in which, of course, the provincial government supported them and reported back on the claims that were shared with them. So we supported them in doing that wealth profiling, and then we also supported them in administratively in disbursing that COVID relief amount that federal government wanted to do that. So there was collaboration, but that was on a secondary level. This situation made Government of Punjab realize the weaknesses of the social protection systems and mechanisms available with them. So there was a quick response to all these shortcomings, and realizing our weaknesses and difficulties, Government of Punjab took certain initiatives, in which the major one was the RISE framework, which required a responsive, a shock responsive social protection mechanisms in Punjab. Under that RISE framework, which when PSPA was a part of that consultation and that which devised this framework, it was required, or it was decided, to have a shock responsive social protection system. It also required to have a tool with which we could judge the vulnerability of a specific geographical area. Dr. Suhail Anwar has also pointed out that. So it was decided to develop a spatial vulnerability index, which could be utilized as a tool for earmarking the development funds for the area as per their vulnerability of the area's vulnerability and the need. And then there was a need to have a formal system where the provincial government could enroll its own beneficiaries, could reach out to its own potential beneficiaries, and people could be enrolled in order to support them in any of the shocks. And then there was a need to have some amount allocated specifically to meet such expenditures that would be required due to any shock. This time it was COVID. So there was a need to have a social protection fund in Punjab. As the Minister of Finance has also pointed out, that it's among the provinces, it's only Punjab that had a dedicated entity for social protection, the Punjab Social Protection Authority. So most of the COVID response or shock responsive measures were to be taken by PSPA. One of the other initiative that was taken was to expedite the role of Punjab Ehsaas program. Punjab Ehsaas program was designed prior to this pandemic, but due to certain reasons, and among them access to data was the major reason, could not be rolled out, unfortunately. But what we did was to make that rollout possible during this COVID. So during 2020, PSPA rolled out 4 new programs targeting the elderly. The program is called Bahimmat Buzurg program, which is a social pension, non-contributory pension, especially focusing the poor women. This was the targeted beneficiaries were beyond the best households. So they took the threshold was from 16.18 poverty means testing score to up to 30. And since these poor women usually do not have an access to formal employments, and so they are deprived of any post-retirement benefits, they are usually unable to make any savings. So this was a target group for intervention. So we focused this program primarily on women, but if in a household of the same PMT score, a woman is not available, then the older man with this 65 plus age is a beneficiary of this program. So far, we have enrolled some 80,000 people in this program, but the enrollment of this program has deliberately been slowed down because we were using the previous data, and we were waiting for the new NACR data, which we were promised to be able to given earlier this year, but unfortunately it's not available with us. So, but the target population is around 1,500,000 beneficiaries in Punjab. Then we rolled out another program that is for the acid burn victims, which is called Nayi Zindagi program. This is for the financial, psychological, physical rehabilitation of these victims. Then there is a program for the needy artists, which is called Silai Fund program. You see, the lockdowns probably hurt the entertainment industry the most, and most of these the lower income artisans and artists become jobless, and they were in this need of assistance. So in collaboration with Information and Culture Department of Punjab, we started this program in which we provide 5,000 per month assistance to the needy artists. And then we rolled out another program named Masawat, which is for transgender person. This program has been launched in 2021. This is for the economic and social inclusion of transgender persons. It's an unconditional cash transfer for any transgender person age 45 and above, having a CNIC declared, on which it's declared as the person is a transgender person. Then in 2020, I'm sorry I missed that, one mega project for human capital accumulation was launched in Punjab called Punjab Human Capital Investment Project. The geographical area is the poorest south and 4 districts of the Sargodha division. This program has 3 main components. It is based on life cycle approach, taking care of a child from the time of its conception to covering the early 1,000 days of his life with the help of by improving the uptake of health, improved health facilities. It has 2 dimensions to this. The supply side is being catered by the health department, which is supposed to man its BHUs and provide all the required equipment for making them functional for 24/7. And then also it has for the demand side, it has a CCT component to it, providing a cash transfer to pregnant lactating mothers in order to incentivize their uptake of these services. Then for this social inclusion of these healthy children, there are early childhood classes in 3,400 schools in South, and also for the economic inclusion of these young parents who are the target beneficiaries for this program, who would be the parents of these healthy children that we intend to support. So there is an asset transfer program for these young parents in all these 11 districts of Punjab. Recently, we have brought another program, which is the scale up of our earlier program, but it's with new contours. It's called Hum Kadam program, and this is an assistance for persons with disability in Punjab. And this time we have broadened the scope this program. It was earlier for PMT 0 to 20, and this has shifted to 0 to 30 PMT score. For the upcoming programs, we have a program designed especially for the rural women. I'm sure Dr. Adil must be interested in knowing that. It's called the Wings program, which we are designing for rural women and trying to bring in some innovation to practice some innovative model of graduation especially for the rural women. And then we are also bringing in a program for the financial and economic inclusion of the minorities. It would be a program for vocational training and linking them to microfinance. And we're also bringing in a program for assistive devices for improving the mobility of the persons with disability here. So when it comes to complementarities and see where the coordination can be, I think for effective social protection implementation, we need vertical as well as horizontal coordination and complementarities, starting from support from federal government. I think federal government can play its role by improving and strengthening the administrative capacity of social protection agencies of the provinces, and then it's better suited to its role that they take on the poverty assessment assignment and the reporting aspect of the SP programs. But there need to be some delegation, and there need to be more respect to 18th Amendment, and there are certain tasks that could be performed by the provinces better or the local governments better than the federal government. And I think it's time that there should be a realization and there should be a redistribution of assignments among these different tiers, as Sir Captain Said Saab has pointed out that having a shared vision is usually a difficult thing. But I think at the moment, it's unfortunate for the SP sector, especially in Punjab, because I think there is zero conflict between the federal and the provincial government. But despite the fact we are not being made part of most of the programs that BISP or PAS division are designing and bringing it down, which leads to duplication of resources, which leads to confusion for the implementation of different programs. And for example, there is duplication that PSPA and PAS are having the similar kind of programs like Asas Nashwanuma, which contradicts or which is like a duplication of PHCIP, and unfortunately it overlaps on the same district and same geographical area as well. So to avoid these duplications, I think we need to have more open discussion and collaboration and support. For example, for this Asas Amdan, this Asas Ration Madad program, which is the targeted subsidy program, the provinces have to contribute for this program, but they have not been made part of the design. If they could have been taken on board a little earlier, so things would have been easier for both the partners, and there would have been more goodwill among the provinces as well. So I think as a way forward, my last comment, I think there is a need to have a National Social Protection Council having representation from all the social protection agencies, so that we could sit together and design programs in such a way that we could avoid duplication and we could utilize the scarce resources more efficiently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Vinisahi, for your comprehensive comments concerning the initiatives and the impediments, especially the lack of data with provincial authorities. Now, moving very quickly to an integral stakeholder in the social protection domain, the international development sector. We have with us Mr. Henlo Nguyen Hussain, the Principal Consultant, Oxford Policy Management, and he will be giving the perspective on the public finance management and resource optimization for social protection and policy instrument for social protection mechanism. Mr. Henlo, please.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to start off, but to say that I'm not a social protection expert. Just want to clarify that from the very start. My focus is very much on public finances, and that also explains the kind of heading that was given to my name. But I'm very honored to be here and to be part of these discussions. And I'll try to be quite brief, and there's three things that I just want to briefly touch on. Firstly, I think in order to look at how we sustainably finance social protection, but also specifically shock responsive social protection moving forwards, we do need to look and give serious consideration to the question about how will these initiatives be financed over the short, the medium, and the long term. And in terms of that, I'm unfortunately not coming with any answers tonight, but I do want to raise some questions in that area and in terms of issues that we should be considering. Now, if we look at specifically how the COVID-19 responses have been financed globally in terms of social protection, I think there's some important questions or issues raised when you analyze that in terms of looking at how we approach social protection also moving forward. Firstly, there's been some serious uncertainty, specific decisions that were made in terms of how to finance social protection measures from our current budgets. Now, those decisions that we've made in terms of how to finance it has got specific opportunity costs attached to them. And understanding those also give us important information about whether those are the options and the routes that we want to follow in future, or whether there's different choices to be made in terms of how we fund social protection in the future. Now, traditionally, as a PFM consultant, when you ask me about fiscal space and where do we find financing and funding for specific initiative or new initiatives without undermining the credibility of the budget, there would broadly be 4 areas that a public finance consultant would look at to try and identify that fiscal space. Firstly, we would look at whether we can reprioritize the spending that's been allocated or is available within the current budget. So that's a kind of a zero-sum game. So you're not looking for new finances, you're looking at whether you can pull funds from one sector to fund another sector. So in a lot of the responses that we've seen in terms of the pandemic, that's exactly the decision that a lot of governments has made. In order to fund social protection, health responses, etc., funds were drawn from other sectors in order to fund those initiatives. And that's traditionally one of the areas that we would look at for fiscal space, and looking at reprioritization processes in terms of making those types of decisions. Now, in terms of this reprioritization, there's some tools that you can use, such as public expenditure reviews. So therefore looking at, what is the spending levels that's happening within specific sectors? Are those sectors actually efficiently and effectively spending the funds that have been allocated to them? And if not, then maybe we need to consider moving those funds to a sector that's better able to spend it in a meaningful way, potentially such as social protection or shock responsive social protection. Can we identify inefficiencies within the budget? So in Pakistan and on S&G specifically, a lot of the support that we provided to the finance departments in both provinces focused in on trying to identify inefficiencies within the budget, unspent funds that have been lying dormant in bank accounts potentially over years that can be reallocated to fund health responses and social protection spending. The third element that we normally look at in terms of finance or looking for additional fiscal space is increasing revenue. Now, tax revenue in particular is obviously the mechanism that one looks at then in order to actually not just use what is available, but to actually expand the amount of funds that's available to fund additional measures in areas such as social protection. And here it's very important to look specifically at progressive taxation, and that's specifically looking at issues such as income tax, corporate tax, natural resources or extraction taxation, property and inheritance, hotels and tourism taxation. So those are normally the type of progressive tax instruments that we will look to in order to see if we can expand the amount of financing that's available for additional spending within government. Another element in the fourth or third one that we kind of look at is managing debt and looking specifically at borrowing or debt restructuring. Now, this is not normally an instrument that you would look for in terms of the social sectors. And then the last one being aid, international aid, basically. But in terms of the COVID period specifically, the instrument that was predominantly used by governments across the globe has been very much about reprioritization of existing funds to sectors such as health, sectors such as social protection. Now, due to the duration of this particular pandemic, and also what this tells us, or what this kind of gives us a sight into disasters, pandemics moving forward, and how we would have to be able to respond in a shock responsive way in social protection, it does tell us that those instruments won't necessarily be sustainable in order to fund crises moving forward. And as such, there's quite a lot of international debates happening in terms of innovative solutions for financing, specifically in terms of shock responsive social protection. And I just want to highlight a couple very briefly as my final before I end. First of all, there's quite a lot of emphasis and discussions happening currently on taxation on international financial transactions, as well as carbon emissions as possible vehicles to help fund expanded social protection initiatives and also to fund shock responsive social protection specifically. The use of contingency funds is increasingly being observed and is being utilized across governments internationally. Well, contingency funds is basically a small amount of money that's set aside in the budget every year, in the annual budget, that is basically there for unanticipated expenditure items, to which a crisis situation such as the pandemic, etc., could potentially funding for enhanced social protection measures can potentially be pulled from those types of avenues. Now, traditionally, that contingency budgets, however, are quite small in nature, and moving forward, there would need to be consideration towards increasing the amount of funds that's put away from them. One step up in the ladder from contingency funds is very much the establishment of natural disaster funds. Now, when you look at disaster risk financing specifically, there is a lot of talk around the use of natural disaster funds within budgets. Now, this is normally through a piece of legislation that stipulates that you put X% of the annual budget into a natural disaster fund. And then also stipulates very concretely under which conditions you can access those funds. It defines what a disaster is. And quite often what you can find is that shock responsive measures in terms of social protection qualifies then as part of the disaster element that can be accessed during a situation like the pandemic very much. You can also look at to which degree you can use climate finance to be used to shock-proof social protection systems and programs, specifically where there is a very close linkage increasingly between climate change and the vulnerabilities of people in response to climate change, and therefore also the shock responsive measures that we need to take in response to that. Therefore, there's a really urgent policy question on, in terms of how do we fund routine programs and stabilize the funding of routine social protection programs, but also try to expand social protection moving forward in order to enable vulnerable groups in society to actually cope with shocks with the assistance of government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now moving quickly to Mr. Syed Mustafa, Technical Advisor, Social Protection, GIZ, Pakistan. So Mustafa Saab, lot has been discussed, multiple aspects has been discussed. Now is the time to deliberate upon the need for dialogue and mutual space concerning social protection. Your take on that briefly?
Thank you. I'll try to be as brief as possible. I think we are running a bit late and I can see that people are a bit anxious to get on with it. But first of all, it's an honor to speak to the experts in the audience. If I would just like us to perhaps take a step back and think what social protection is, right? It's basically based on three very important concepts. One is decommodification of labor, there's social solidarity, and then, of course, there's voluntary action. Let me explain a bit. The first act of social protection was not with Bismarck in 1883, nor was it with the Poor Laws of 1601. It was when the first humans realized that somebody next to them was no longer able to catch their own food or forage, and they decided to share their food. That's when social protection started. Now, there is an issue over here. When we give this role of social protection to the state, we see some problems arising. I think one of the most important and pertinent problems that we've seen arising is that of targeting. Who do we know is eligible? Let's say if we go back 100 years, we had guilds and membership where I was protected by my own community of, let's say, consultants. You know, you're a consultant, I'm a consultant, we are part of the same guild, and we would know how much we are earning and we would be able to protect ourselves, so on and so forth. When we give that role to the state no longer knows who is poor, who is rich, without complete information. Now, it's very difficult, and that's when we resort to targeting instruments such as means testing and proxy means testing. These are expensive in terms of their administrative costs. We also have things such as what type of benefits to give and what type of interventions to have. For example, I'm sure, Akal being from Balochistan, I'm sure you'd agree that 3,000 rupees or 2,000 rupees might go a long way in some place like Pusdar as compared to Lahore, right? However, when we give this role to a state, we have to resort to these preset formulas that we then use of how much we can give. It's a very blanket one-size-fits-all solution. Those solutions, we see that they don't often at times work. That is why in most advanced social protection system, there's an increasing reliance on caseworkers who advise, who try to assist in how to actually improve the circumstances of each and every individual who is the subject of state assistance. Given the complexity of some of the issues that we are facing, for example, let's take the example of COVID and the extent of the labor market shocks that we experienced. Lockdowns, smart lockdowns. There is absolutely no way that we would ever be able to devise and implement a public works program at a level where we have our governance structures right now. And I think it goes back to what some of the panelists said, that we need more devolved structures in order to be adaptive, in order to be able to respond quickly to some of the challenges which are arising. Another very good example of this is climate change. You can't have a one-size-fits-all solution for climate change. You need localized solutions. There is, however, this aspect where if we want to improve our system, we have to take the decision-making, information gathering to the tier of government which is closest to the citizen. That way, people know who is actually there, decision-making, and also I think it goes back to what Dr. Adil had said about taxation. People are going to be far less, let's say, willing to mislead a particular government functionary if they know that they are very close by to them. And that is something that we see with city councils and taxation with city councils. So it also addresses some issues of asymmetric information and moral hazard. There is, however, a more sinister problem which arises when we look at and when we try to delegate the role of social protection to the state. And that is that we forgo the voluntary aspect of social protection and me wanting to help my fellow citizen, and we replace that with a coercive taxman and a tax collector who is then doing everything on our behalf. Now, that is where the test of morality of government comes in, where I think it was Jean Bastiat who very clearly said that the test of morality of governance is whether you would condone or condemn the same act if it were done by an individual. So here we see that there is some sort of conflicting interests that happen. What we also see is that often at times when we give this role to the state, a lot of actions are done which are in the name of, let's say, the greater good, which are in the name of, let's say, a democratically elected government. And intellectuals do argue that this is done in line with the social contract. But if we look at our history, it has often been some heinous crimes which have been committed because it is a very slippery and dangerous road of being able to take that decision-making power from lower tiers of government. If we want to navigate this morass of conflicting interests and conflicting rights and be able to develop a consensus, and I think it's again Dr. Adil who pointed out that a new type of a social contract, a new type of consensus thinking, we need to have that social dialogue. And I'm afraid it's not us who would have to then determine what route to take, but we would have to lead the way to the people who finance social protection and the people who benefit from it. So I think without that dialogue, we risk developing a system which works for the benefit of a few at the expense of a lot of people, and we would end up in exactly the same situation that we are right now. So that's it from my side, and just one short closing remark that there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, and that's by Thomas Sowell. And if we want to find the trade-off that we are comfortable with, we need to have that dialogue. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Mustafa Saab. Now I would request the chair of the session, Qazi Azmat Isa Saab, for concluding remarks of the session. Sir, please.
Thank you very much. This has been an incredible session, and once again, congratulations to SDPI and FCDO. I mean, the kind of the range of views and experiences shared has been phenomenal. And I think the challenge for SDPI is going to be now, how do you actually put this all together and follow it up? So let me first of all congratulate the government. I've been involved in these programs, in a big way right from the start when the earthquake happened, Pakistan's biggest disaster. And alhamdulillah, I think if you look at the track record of the government on these big disasters like the earthquake, like the floods, and now COVID, it's been very good. But I think with the challenge, and I think this is where the speakers have really focused on, is the challenge has been the engagement of the state with its citizen over the long period of time. And that, I think, is going to be, I'm just going to tease some of those out. I'm going to cherry pick some of the comments that have come through. and, perhaps focus more on the future. And that's what the title of the program is, beyond the pandemic, leaving no one behind. So let me just start with, I seek your indulgence, just a few things that caught my eye. And first of all, in terms of Dr. Sohail, it's like capturing the ocean in a box, कि पूरे समंदर को आपने कूजे में बंद करना है, तो मुश्किल होगा. I'm just going to focus on a few things. For instance, Dr. Sohail set a really nice kind of set the scene in terms of what the social protection policy would be, and particularly on things like spatial vulnerability. And I think the important thing here was to actually now, the other provinces, and this is where I feel as a Balochistan that in terms of no one, leaving no one behind, we are very much centric, and even FCDO, just focusing on 2 districts. And I think in terms of the panel, in terms of other provinces representation, that should have been there as well. And I think data sharing across provinces in terms of the social protection programs of Punjab and KP, how can you help Sindh and Balochistan in that, and data sharing protocols need to be established. Then I think we're moving on to Nadeem Saab, and I think he gave some excellent, recommendations, particularly in terms of, how the IT can be leveraged in so many ways. Particularly he was talking about the wallet, and wallet has huge potential, and we're just using it for one function. And in terms of, he even proposed that, BISP should develop its own wallet and, give out these smartphones to all its beneficiaries, and that would really kind of, in a way, liberate a whole, the population of the 15 million who are receiving the 5 million who are receiving the BIS stipend, and the 15 million who got the emergency cash. And I think the other thing that is, that Pakistan, that could also help is the low financial literacy that could be leveraged as well. Then we moved on to Saeed Nawaz Saab, federal government passed, who've done a remarkable job in terms of, rolling out a system so transparently. And, 15 million people, this is not a joke. Like I said, on these big programs, the government has done very well. And I think for me, what stuck out on his presentation was basically the framework for collaboration. I think this shared vision is absolutely essential. Unfortunately, Pakistan, you don't see that shared vision. And I think it's important, and using institutions like the Council of Common Interest, like was proposed, I think would really kind of benefit. And I think that council needs to be meeting much more often. And particularly, somebody suggested, Dr. Dinesh suggested the council, the Social Protection Council. I think that would be very, very useful in that sense. Then my colleague, Mr. Khurram Dastagir, I think that was a very, very powerful, and I think this is something that plagues all of us, and I think we need to really focus in on is, how should this country be governed? What are the kind of institutions that will, deliver to the people? And I was just reminded of, of a book which is called Why States Fail. It's a very famous book, and I'm sure a lot of you have read it or come across it. And if you were to ask me, what is that one line in that book that encapsulates the whole, the book, it's basically states fail, he says. These are 2 Harvard professors. States fail because they lack inclusive institutions. And this is so true. And I think that is one of our dilemma. And the other thing is that institutions do not evolve. Institutions, unfortunately, in Pakistan, some of the greatest institutions, be it the airline or WAPDA, we had some wonderful institutions, they've all gone in decline because they did not evolve. They were not responsive to the needs of the people. And I think that is a fundamental, raison of institutions, because human beings, go up and then decline, and that's a natural progress, but institutions don't have to go that way. And when you look at countries like Japan, for instance, they have, 1,000-year-old institutions, and they've striven for this, constant improvement, they call it kaizen, constantly improving themselves so that they stay responsive, agile, to the needs of the people. And I think Khurram Saab has really, made us think in that regard. How do we design these programs And I think designing the key word here is inclusion, so that people from all parts of Pakistan feel that they are also citizens of this country. So moving on to Dr. Adil Malik, I think Dr. Saab touched on something very close to my heart, because he was talking about the rural poor and about the social capital and social mobilization. And I think that is absolutely, for me, and I think this panel, if I may say so, not meant as any criticism, is basically we did not touch upon the value of engaging with communities, community mobilization, how you can make everything better if you have their voice, if you have their participation in this whole process. Because then you can be, we talked about targeting is better, you can be creative, you can have in terms of better accountability, better transparency, if you're involving communities. And that investment, and PPF, the Pakistan Poverty Alleviation Fund, this is what it leveraged. Leverage social capital, leverage institutions, and that's why delivering social protection or delivering infrastructure or delivering microfinance is far easier, transparent, and sustainable in that way. So I think, Dr. Adil has raised lots of very important, thought-provoking things about changing the rules of the game, need for a new social contract. And I think, it is the political will is required to do this, because these things are, perhaps easier said than done, because there are so many vested interests. So who will rise above all that to ensure that it is at the end of the day that we're delivering for the people of this country and we are accountable to them. So greater voice, greater agency. And I think what is important is if you were to measure everything by, and the heterogeneity of this country that, Syed Saab talked about, Syed Mustafa talked about, in terms of how everything is, development is localized. You need to have that kind of voices from the people themselves to ensure that whatever we do, it is relevant to their needs. And I think that is extremely important as we move along. And we're talking about, he talked about Gwadar. I was going to talk about Gwadar, and I think this is very important that, people are saying we're talking about the long-term engagement. It is shameful, as a Pakistani, I bow my head in shame, that we have a spectrum, and this is from government data, Planning Commission, UNDP, that when they were ranked districts on poverty, 150 districts of Pakistan, they ranked, like Lahore had no surprises, lowest poverty in Pakistan, 4%. And Qila Abdullah on the other end of the spectrum, the poverty, nobody would be able to guess, was 96.5. 96.5, we are in one country. And when you look at all of Balochistan, other than 2 districts maybe of Balochistan, Quetta and Gwadar maybe, every district of Balochistan has poverty levels of higher than 75%. And this is not acceptable. And I think this is where the state needs to engage long-term, graduate people out of poverty. And one of the things that you talked about in terms of how do we finance, and I think very important, very thought-provoking, is the fact that one way to finance it is to ensure they don't need social protection. You graduate them out of it. Social protection is not really poverty alleviation. You have to have livelihood programs. You have to build human capital. And I think, the minister from Punjab, Makhloon Saab, he talked about the new paradigm. This is very much, the world, when the world measures poverty or the progress of nations and the sustainable development goals, all of them, they point towards human, capital. And that's how you achieve growth. That's how you achieve, human dignity. We talked about that, is to ensure that, you're taking people along. Just to give you one other example, because I want people to leave here, hopefully, angry to go out there and make a change. For instance, I'll give you one example. One data, because Pakistan is such an incredibly large country, 220 million people at least, and so heterogeneous, people forget the heterogeneity of this country. If you were to look at, maternal mortality as one data set, you'd see that in Pakistan, the national maternal mortality is 130 for 100,000, which is very high compared to, South Asian countries, obviously nowhere close to the West. But if you were to dig deeper and look at what it is in Balochistan, again, sorry to keep bringing Balochistan in because, I think the people of Gwadar have been talking about कि जी हम आपके वादे नहीं सुन रहे, हम चाहते हैं आप हमें करके दिखाएं. And I think that's why they're still out there, because the government has agreed to all their demands, but they say, no, it's not about agreeing to that demand, it is about delivering on our demands. That is what we mean. So coming back to the statistic, 130 nationally, 960 for Balochistan. I mean, I don't know about what the stats are in Afghanistan now, but I worked in Afghanistan as well. It was better than Balochistan. This is unacceptable. We should be, as Pakistanis, be angry, and that should also lead us to one of the other things that I have learned is the power of partnerships. And I think we all need to recognize this as well. And this is the second, slight grouse I have. Then I think we need to recognize and have the generosity to accept everyone who's contributed to these efforts. We have not heard anybody talk about civil society. Civil society reaches out to all these people, probably the most marginalized. Do we recognize their efforts? All these programs are built around. I think only Professor Saab mentioned Ahuat once. That's it. Civil society is a key member, a key player in all of this. I think we should, as government, as provincial governments, and academia, and think tanks, we all have. And when, these kind of partnerships happen, magic happens. And I've seen that happen, be it at the earthquake, when we work together with a whole range of people, or in the COVID response. I think that's what we need to. We are not naturally collaborative people, sadly. We need to actually try and make an effort to make sure that we collaborate and coordinate. Just a couple of more points, and I think so I've not missed out anything. And, I think the ones on finance, very important. And, I think to end with Mr. Mustafa, I think those were very, what should I say, very thought-provoking and very insightful. And I think it brings us back to the power of communities, the power of values, because when you have such an incredibly diverse country, heterogeneity from Gilgit to Gwadar, I think what is the only thing that grounds you? And I think the only thing that grounds you is your values, because it's the needs of the people of Gwadar is going to be different to the needs of the people of Gilgit. And you have to, all development is local. But when you have the benchmark of values, and what are the values? The values they were like part of our faith. They were the 5 values. And I think if you were to measure every intervention based on values, then I think we can't go wrong as a country. First value, inclusion. Inclusion. Be it women, be it people with disabilities, be it, people living in Dera Bukti or Waziristan. That is number 1. Number 2, participation. It's not only to get them around the table and it is for they're having their voice, having agency, be able to articulate their needs to people. That's number 2. And then the 2 other are the government's values of accountability, transparency, to ensure whatever happens, everyone is aware of it. In whatever way it is, from a very sophisticated financial system to something that is written behind a mosque saying, okay, itne paise mile the, and this is how it was used, and this is how many community contributed. And then the last one, which is like, it's called sustainability in the West, but I'd much rather use a much more kind of all-encompassing word, which is stewardship. We have been designated the stewards. We are only the Almighty has has ownership. We are holding this earth for our children and our grandchildren. Have we been good stewards to it? And I think what is important is now we need to reflect, because Pakistan, unfortunately, my last comment, and I'd like to also thank Dr. Freya for actually conducting this so well and efficiently, and thank you very much for helping me out here. Is basically to ensure that we do right by the people of Pakistan, because mashallah, all of you are in very senior positions, and I think if you were to have this kind of benchmark of these values. Okay, do these programs meet our values? Are we being collaborative? Are we recognizing the efforts of others? I think that is very important. So thank you very much. It's been a real privilege and an honor to be in such august company, and best of luck with all that you do. Thank you very much, particularly Dr. Abid. Thank you very much for watching here.
Thank you very much, Qazi Sasa, for such powerful concluding remarks. Now, for the closure of the session and the interest of time, I would request Executive Director STPI, Dr. Abid Suleri, and Dr. Waqar, Joint Executive Director STPI, for a joint vote of thanks.
Thank you, Fariha. I'll leave a vote of thanks to Waqar. Just make a couple of comments. Think tanks in Pakistan and in most of the developing countries, I think they face a dilemma that they require access to the policymakers and access to the policy implementers. STPI is in a unique position in Pakistan, where being an independent policy think tank, we have the access to the highest level. And that's where conferences like this and sessions like this, those become very important, because when we are approached or when we are asked for any solution or any advice, we need to give some evidence-based advice, and we need to provide some collective advice. Now, how this session related to the meeting that I attended straight from presidency after the inaugural of our STC, I had to join Prime Minister's macroeconomic advisory group. And some of the questions which were being discussed there, and I've just paraphrased them in my own language, and I'll request SNG, OPM, FCDO, and of course STPI's team and all others who are sitting here to provide some answers. The first question is that can the social protection mechanism, existing social protection mechanisms, those can be used to provide the targeted subsidies beyond food. For example, if the government wants to make a distinction that someone who runs a Fortuner or a Land Cruiser and someone who runs a motorbike or a rickshaw, if both of them, those have to be provided energy at a different cost, what would be a doable mechanism? Can some sort of a cash grant be possible using NSCR, FPR, NADRA, and other excise and taxation data? Second thing that is again asked over and over again is about the different type of social protection mechanisms which are on. We have health card, we have Kisan card, we have supports card, and Kamyab Jawan Pakistan program, and all of the things that have been discussed here. So are we spreading ourselves too thinly? Or can we wait for any one scheme to first conclude and then start the second? Do we have time, the government, in next 18 months, what would be the best strategy to do it? The third thing that was discussed there, that if all of what government is doing and all of what which was said by the reps of Punjab here, if it's really working well, is it not sufficient to control inflation? Our government is not able to market it proper, brand it proper. So how come that every night from 7 to 11, you switch on to any TV talk show, and that would keep on presenting the doom and gloom picture, and no one highlights some of the good things that the government has been doing. I don't have the ready answer for all of these questions, but I look forward to the co-organizers of this session to provide me some of the answers, and I can assure you that I'll take it to right to the ears of Prime Minister, so that your recommendations, those can get implemented in a proper manner. Thank you.
Sir, please.
Thank you, Dr. Suleri. And of course, as I stand between you and the dinner, let me congratulate all of you for not just participating in a session on social protection, but a workshop on social protection. It almost, we've covered aspects so comprehensively. We have gone from a shared vision to political economy, to legal structures, to systems and processes, and of course, fiscal sustainability and IT interventions. So let me, of course, start by thanking Dr. Fariha and Dr. Sohail for really organizing this and thinking this through. And they were, of course, helped by colleagues from OPM. Henlo is here. Thank you very much. And we had colleagues from FCTO, Naveed and Sana are here, who really helped us to think this through and bring this to your attention, and of course have this very detailed input. Let me also thank all the speakers and the panelists. Wouldn't really make an effort to repeat each of their names, but that really doesn't mean that I would be doing any disrespect. We're really grateful. Some of the esteemed panelists have traveled from long distances. We are grateful some couldn't travel and have joined online, and we really respect their time. Thank you to Qazi Saab for really chairing the session. We are very encouraged by the participation of the government here, particularly by past division. Additional Secretary Saab is here, Punjab Social Protection Authority, and we had in the audience our colleagues from BISP, State Bank of Pakistan, and several who joined online. And I think last but not the least, let me also thank our other development partners who have made this year's STC possible. I can see Sayyid Mustafa Saab, GIZ has participated. We have colleagues from SNGKP who have joined us. I can see Shahid Saab here. So really grateful to all of you. And as Dr. Suleri said, the thought process doesn't stop over here. Putting these thoughts into action is probably the task for the research team here at STPI, which we look forward to completing with your help. Thank you so much. So maybe we can proceed for dinner now? Yeah, please.